And also a reminder, your research paper's due in 2 weeks. I know it sneaks up on you. Just a reminder, if you want me to look at a rough draft of your paper, you can just email it to me and I'll take a look and feedback. That's not a problem. All right, so we are going to talk Congress today. And this is timely given that we just had a Supreme Court justice confirmed yesterday in a very, very, very partisan, ugly confirmation process. So that was really quite interesting. We're going to talk about representation, constituencies, and so on. Right, Congress. So I always like to start off with one of my favorite jokes about Congress from Mark Twain. Suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. Congress gets a lot of flack, right? We hear a lot of comments about how ineffective Congress is, how power hungry they are, and so on. And there's some validity to that. There's a realization that Congress right now is kind of the do-nothing Congress. They haven't gotten a lot done. They haven't been doing their jobs. It's kind of understandable that people might be feeling like Congress is made up of a bunch of idiots who aren't doing their job. It's funny that this quote comes from the 19th century. This tells you how long people have had this lack of happiness with Congress. It's nothing new. We do have a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 chambers. We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. The number of representatives in the House is not fixed. It's based on population. So right now, we have 435 members in the House. It could go up to 440 after the census, maybe even a little higher. It's not a fixed number. The number will increase as the population increases. The Senate, however, is at 100. It's been that way since the very beginning. Each state gets 2 senators. And of course, this does raise some questions about overrepresentation for rural states, right? The population of the state of Wyoming is the equivalent of the population of Los Angeles County. Wyoming gets 2 senators, and so does California. So how does that work, right? So there's been some questions about, should we look at fixing the Senate? To serve in the House, you have to be at least 25 years old, and you have to have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years. You do not have to be a natural-born citizen. You just have to be a citizen. House members get a 2-year term, and the entire House of Representatives is re-elected every 2 years. So all 435 seats are up for re-election this year. For the Senate, you have to be at least 30. You have to have been a citizen for 9 years. And it's a 6-year staggered term. So only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election at any time. It's why we had Cruz up for re-election in 2018 and John Cornyn up for re-election this year. It's not all at the same time. For the House, because they only get 2 years, there's a lot of pressure to get things done right away. Get into office, you better put forward your legislative agenda immediately. You don't have as much time to do what you want. Because they represent a specific district, they specialize in a very local interest. What are the needs of the people of the Texas 24th, the Illinois 19th, or the Massachusetts 7th? They're focused on a very specific set of people. The Senate is focused on the needs of an entire state. They have to be more broad in their representation. They have to serve a larger and more diverse population. In Texas, right? Ted Cruz has to represent millions of Americans who have very diverse backgrounds, opinions, and so on. The needs of people in Austin are not the same as the needs of the people in the Rio Grande Valley. So they have a little bit more difficulty trying to represent an entire state versus one particular district. So there's a couple of different types of representation that each member of Congress will have to figure out if that works for them. For some members, they consider themselves a delegate representative. This means that they vote according to what their constituents want. So they'll take into consideration what their constituents need. The problem with this is that we don't tend to pay attention to every issue. We pay attention to the issues that matter to us. So it's harder to know how to respond to an issue if you're not getting any feedback from your constituents. There's also what they call a trustee representation, where the member of Congress says, I'm empowered to make the decisions that I think are best for you. You're not always going to know what you want, so I'm going to make the decisions for you. This can be problematic because then they're not paying enough attention to what their constituents want. And in this case, the only real power the constituents have is in voting. So if their member's not doing what they want, they could choose to vote them out of office. But either way, there's going to be some difficulty in trying to figure out how to best represent the people of your district or your state. It also matters who's representing you. It's beneficial if your representative has the same racial, gender, ethnic, religious, or educational background. If you live in a majority Hispanic district, but your representative is white, you're not necessarily reflecting the community. So it helps if your representative shares similar physiological factors. It means they're better prepared to represent their constituents. And there's also the issue of agency. We can hold our representatives accountable if we're not happy with their job. We can choose not to re-elect them. We can choose not to even re-nominate them. This will convince members sometimes to support what their constituents want, even if it's not what they want. If it's a highly competitive district, then the representative is going to vote the way their constituents want. If they get enough pushback from their constituents saying, we don't think you're doing your job properly, we may replace you in the next election. The threat may be enough to get them to change what they're doing, to push them into changing their behavior. We do have some accountability. We can say to them, you've had enough. You're not doing your job. We're not paying you to sit there and not do anything, so you gotta go. So in terms of the composition of Congress itself, religiously speaking, the majority are Protestant. There are some Jewish members of Congress, including Bernie Sanders, Muslim, but they do tend to be mostly Protestant. After the 2018 election, 9% of Congress is African American, although 13.3% of the population, generally speaking, is African American. 7% of Congress is now Latino versus 17.5% of the population. And 3% is Asian American, while the population overall is 5.5% Asian. The minorities are still underrepresented. It's getting better, but it's still not anywhere near the levels it should be. Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House in 2006. She is again Speaker of the House because Democrats took back control of the House of Representatives in 2008. She's been the only female Speaker of the House so far. And it was a positive sign in 2018 that we had 106 women elected to the House of Representatives, 25 to the Senate. It's still way underrepresented, but it's the highest numbers of women we've ever had in Congress. It's a positive sign. Fun fact about Congress, it wasn't until 1993 that women were allowed to wear pants on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Yeah. All right. In terms of occupation and education, most members of Congress do have a legal background. This makes sense. You want people who know the law to make the law. So it makes sense that most members of Congress have studied law, even in pre-law majors, a fair number with political science majors as well. A lot of them have ties to various businesses and industries, tech industry, oil, natural gas, agriculture, and so on, which again makes sense. You were working for a business, couldn't get Congress to help you out, you run for office, you try to help your business friends out. Over 90% of the members of Congress have a college degree of some kind. More than a third have a law degree. Well, this is good in some ways because it does mean Congress members are generally pretty well versed in policy and law, it does mean that Congress doesn't reflect the American people. It's made up of the educated and the elite. There's still a fair number of Americans who don't have a college degree, who aren't millionaires, who aren't someone with advanced degrees. So it's hard to see that Congress is taking our needs seriously when they don't reflect the American public. We see that playing out with the holdup over the second round of stimulus checks. For most members of Congress, who cares, right? We don't need the money. The American people do. So their stalling and unwillingness to negotiate with each other is causing more people to fall into poverty right now. And it's like you just want to say to them, like, you guys just stop playing around and freaking figure something out already. And there are exceptions. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for all of the controversy around her, she is more reflective of her district. She's a former bartender. She didn't make a lot of money, so she can understand what her constituents need. Like her or not, we could actually use more people from her background in Congress. Someone who understands what it's like to be living paycheck to paycheck. Alright, so it's kind of hard to read this chart, I understand, but basically this breaks down the difference between Congress and the American people. 51% of Congress is made up of millionaires. I can't even read that. Less than 5% of the American people are millionaires. We've got a little over half of Congress represented by millionaires. Only about 5% of the population is actually millionaires. 77% of Congress is made up of white men. White men only make up 31% of the American population. 20% of Congress is female. 51% of Americans are female. 67% of Congress is over the age of 55 versus about 28% of Americans in general. So Congress is wealthier, wider, and older compared to the American population. It doesn't help that we have senators like Dianne Feinstein, who's 84 years old, serving in the Senate. We can count the number of senators, especially under the age of 50, very easily. The majority of them are older. John Cornyn, I believe, is somewhere in his 60s or 70s. It's not exactly helpful, right? And it doesn't help when you think about the fact that Feinstein was given a 6-year term in 2018, which means she'd be about 90 by the time she's up for re-election. In all likelihood, unless she chooses to stand down, she will probably die in office, which is not uncommon. It's kind of a sad commentary on how much Congress doesn't accurately reflect the American people. Minorities are underrepresented, low-income Americans are underrepresented, women are underrepresented, and young people are underrepresented. So take that with a grain of salt. Okay. of the problem people have with Congress is not getting a good response from their members. It's important to keep in mind that the average House member has over 700,000 constituents. That's a lot of emails and phone calls to be going through. That's a lot of information coming in. So it's hard to respond in a timely manner, because if you get to work and you've got 10,000 emails in your inbox, you're going to be spending pretty much all day just sorting through the emails, let alone trying to respond. So to solve some of the issues, some representatives have set up their own website. Every member of Congress has their own page on the Senate or the House website. They've also, of course, set up social media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They also send out e-newsletters to constituents who subscribe. They can get a weekly or monthly newsletter saying, here's what I'm working on, here's the current status of this legislation, and here's when I'll be in the district. And this can solve a lot of the questions that people might ask through email and save both of them the time and hassle of email. So it's helped a bit in terms of trying to control the number of emails. The reality is there's just so much they have to do. So a little under 49% of House staff and about 41% of the Senate staff are working in the district offices, not in Washington, D.C. Because if you have a problem, usually you call your local number first, and then you call Washington, D.C. So you need staff in those district offices. Our House representative has an office here in Weslaco. You could call or you could stop by for an appointment. A way of handling stuff that can be taken care of on the district level. And so the staff members are incredibly important to their members. They are the first line of contact for constituents. They can help them process Social Security or disability benefits. Provide assistance on things like immigration or personal matters. They take care of the kind of day-to-day stuff that people might contact a member of Congress about. And the members are going to be more responsive on issues that affect their constituents on the state or local level. In Texas, they're going to be concerned about issues like the oil industry and agriculture. People don't necessarily pay as much attention on issues of foreign policy. So if they know it's an issue their constituents aren't concerned about, they're free to do whatever they want. If they know there's going to be concern from their constituents, that's when they really try to step it up. So if you find yourself in need of assistance, calling your local office can be an important first step. To give you a personal story, in 2007, I was going to do a study abroad as part of my master's degree by going to Spain for 3 weeks. And so I'd applied for my passport months in advance. The passport office was backed up and backed up. It was getting to be about a week before I was supposed to leave, and I still didn't have my passport. I called my member of Congress. I was in Illinois at the time. They called someone in Washington, D.C. My passport was issued the next day, and the day after that, it arrived from FedEx. So it can be very helpful in getting the ball rolling, because they were like, what's the holdup? And they were able to get an answer for me. They were able to get me my passport. It can be very helpful if you call your member of Congress. Although in my case, it may have also been that I was a pain in his neck, and he was probably like, if we can get rid of her for a couple of weeks, let's do it. Get that issue. Yeah, like, hey, she's leaving the country? All right, yeah. She's out of here, yeah. And I mean, I probably wouldn't have gotten my passport otherwise, so it ended up working out that I was able to get the support that I needed then. Part of the problem we also see in Congress is that over 90% of the incumbents win re-election. Sometimes it's because the people like them. But that's not the case most of the time. A lot of the problem is tied to the fact that the races are not competitive. In 2014, only 49 out of 435 House races were decided by a margin of less than 10%. Only 49 out of 435 House races were considered competitive. The incumbents do tend to win by very large margins. The average margin of victory in the Senate was 22%. In the House, it was 35%. In some races, the party that's the minority party doesn't even bother to run anyone. I think I mentioned that district in Illinois where a literal Nazi was running for power, or for office for the Republicans. That was because no one else would run, and they couldn't do anything about it, right? The Republicans were like, you're an embarrassment, you need to drop out of the race. They couldn't make him because no one else was running. So that's a problem. We don't need literal Nazis running for office. One of the suggestions that does made is currently there are no term limits in Congress. You can run until you lose, decide not to run again, or die. One suggestion that's been made is let's put term limits into place. Let's make these elections more competitive. Because if there isn't an incumbent, then the seat really is up for grabs. And studies have found in elections where there's no incumbent, women are just as likely as men to win their election. We would actually get more women and minorities in Congress because they actually have a better chance of winning if they're not going up against an incumbent. So this would actually help with the issue of underrepresentation in some ways. And in terms of who's in charge of Congress, the economy can definitely play a role in this. If the economy is in trouble, incumbents tend to lose. We saw this happen in 2008. Republicans across the board were punished by the voters because of the recession. They lost the White House and they lost control of the Senate. It went to the Democrats. So sometimes, if the economy is not doing well, the party in power gets punished for it. So it also depends on how the voters are feeling. Voters weren't necessarily happy with the Republicans in Congress in 2018, so they gave Democrats back control of the House. We will have to see this election if Democrats keep control of the House and if they can take control of the Senate. There's a couple of key races that are very close, including one in Arizona. A lot of the problem we see with the elections not being competitive is because of things like gerrymandering. There are only 6 states that require the districts to be drawn up by an independent, bipartisan commission. In most states, it's the majority party in the state legislature that creates the districts. They try to set it up so they will still keep control of the state. Democrats in Illinois are going to set up the districts to go their way. Republicans in Texas are going to set up the districts to go their way. So, to make elections competitive, what we would need to do is make every state use an independent, nonpartisan commission to draw up the lines in a way that's actually fair. Because until we do that, we're still going to see the incumbents winning, not because they're loved, but because there's no one else that can knock them out of their seat. We also see issues with patronage. By and large, members of Congress get reelected because of what they do for their district. We tend to see a practice that's called pork barrel. This is where members will try to get funding for something within their district, like improving public transit, creating new parks, or money for school districts. These are important because then the member can say to their constituents, look at all this funding I got for our district. Look at all these changes I've helped make. And in 2010, there were a little over 11,000 earmarks for various districts that were worth $32 billion. So what they'll do is they will attach something to an existing bill to give their district money. A very infamous example of this is the Alaskan Bridge to Nowhere. Every year, Congress has to pass a highway bill, road maintenance, etc. So in 2005, the representatives from Alaska attached an amendment that would have given them money given them $2 billion for a bridge that will connect a fairly populated island to a town of 8,000 people that was already connected through a ferry. Basically, they wanted to spend $2 billion to build a bridge that led to nothing. Obviously, you don't want money being wasted on a project like that. And it ended up being removed from the bill after Hurricane Katrina. That $2 billion obviously needs to go to New Orleans. That's the kind of thing that Congress members will do. They'll ask for money for a project that is absurd or wasteful. It looks good to their constituents. Look at what I got us. I got us $2 billion for a bridge in Alaska. Yay! Right, so it makes them look good, and it makes them happy, and it makes their constituents happy. Some of what they have to do is just taking care of their constituents, helping people get access to Social Security, disability benefits, immigration issues, helping a surviving spouse get their husband or wife's Social Security benefits, insurance, things like that. Members of Congress can also introduce what's called a private bill. Basically, these just aren't things that are debated on the floor, and they can be done to help someone with an issue like citizenship, taxes, etc. About 75% of private bills deal with citizenship status for foreign nationals. So a business person who wants to expand their business in the U.S. needs help with permanent resident status to do so, they can get it through a private bill. So a lot of what we see happening in Congress is every member trying money for their district or their state so they can play it up when they're up for re-election and look good for their constituents. Part of it's just money grabbing. Who's going to get the most money, that kind of thing. All right, so in terms of the leadership that we see within Congress, the Speaker of the House is the elected leader of the majority party. So when Democrats took back control of the House of Representatives, they elected Nancy Pelosi their speaker. So the majority party in the House picks the speaker. In the Senate, the majority party there picks the president pro tempore. In both chambers, there's also a minority leader, the person who represents the party that doesn't have the majority. So the Senate is Chuck Schumer for the Democrats. The House, I believe, is Kevin McCarthy for the Republicans. The Speaker of the House is chosen by the members of the majority party. We don't get a say in that. We just get a say in who controls Congress. Both parties also use whip, not a literal whip, a metaphorical one, although sometimes they may want to use a literal whip. So these are people within Congress who line up the party members on the various votes. So they're going to coordinate strategy and count the votes. So the Democratic Party whip will go to Nancy Pelosi and say, Speaker Pelosi, we have the votes. Or Speaker Pelosi, we're not there yet. This helps keep the leadership from bringing something to the floor too soon. Helps keep the party members in line. The whips can go to these members of Congress and say, look, the speaker's made it very clear you need to get on board with this or else. So they're basically keeping the party members in line and making sure that if something is going to the floor for a vote, they know that they're going to get the votes that they need. In the Senate, the Vice President is the formal head of the Senate. But of course, he can't be there all of the time. He has other duties that he has to do. So the Senate majority party will elect a president pro tempore. And this is the person who will preside over the Senate when the vice president is not there. So the current president pro tempore is McConnell. If Democrats take back control of the Senate, it could be Chuck Schumer, it could be someone else. So the leadership in both chambers is chosen by the members of the majority party. The minority party has no say in who's Speaker of the House or the President for it. Usually the Vice President is only in the Senate when there's a tie and his vote is needed to cast the tiebreaker. Occasionally overseeing committee hearings, but usually the Vice President isn't there. Okay. Any questions? Any questions online? Another important part of Congress is the various committees. A standing committee is a permanent one. That means this committee exists from one session to the next. They are not dissolved. Permanent committees include House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee. So they're in charge of finding the funding for new legislation. They have jurisdiction over things like taxes, trade, Social Security, and Medicare. So they do the majority of the writing of legislation, figuring out the funding, and so on. There's also a select committee. These are not permanent. They're set up to investigate a particular issue and to hold hearings. The Senate Watergate Committee was set up in 1973 to investigate the break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex, subsequent cover-up, and the abuse of power by President Nixon. It ended up dissolving when Nixon resigned office. So they'll look into a particular issue. There's been committees like the House Select Committee on Benghazi, investigate the attack on our embassy in 2011. The House Select Committee on Hunger, to look at the issue of famine in other countries. Again, usually they're not permanent, although sometimes a select committee can become permanent. After 9/11, there was a House Select Committee on Homeland Security that was set up to oversee the creation of a new permanent Department of Homeland Security. That committee actually became permanent because they created a permanent cabinet position. Another select committee would be the 9/11 Commission that looked into how did this happen, how did the intelligence community get it wrong, and how do we prevent that from happening again. Also, the Warren Commission that was set up to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And usually they will publish their findings. You can buy a copy of the Warren Report. You can buy a copy of the 9/11 Commission because they want the American people to see kind of how they reach these decisions. There's also a joint committee that involves members of the House and the Senate. It's a Joint Armed Services Committee. They can't present legislation, they just look into issues and report back to the other members of the House and the Senate. And during the sessions, there's also a conference committee. They exist to reconcile the differences between a bill that was introduced in the House and one that was introduced in the Senate, and to try and reach a compromise. So conference committees are critical when we have a split Congress, when we have one party controlling the House and one party controlling the Senate. So right now, conference committees are important. If Democrats manage to take control of the Senate and hold on to the House, they won't necessarily need conference committees other than to reconcile differences in bill language. So these committees are more important when one party controls the House, one controls the Senate. They can get ugly and they can get contentious because of the partisanship that we see between the parties and their unwillingness to compromise. We've got one version of a new stimulus bill in the House. We've got Mitch McConnell in the Senate saying, I won't sign off on this, and so they're going back and forth again. If you're ever interested in kind of seeing the committees in action, they're usually broadcast on C-SPAN. So you can see the House Armed Services Committee in action, or education, or something like that, if you're interested in seeing how these committees work. Right, so how are these committees organized? Usually it is by seniority. The longer you've been in Congress, the more likely you are to get the position that you want. If you're a brand new member of the House of Representatives, you're not getting onto Homeland Security. You're probably getting on the sub-agricultural committee on beets or something like that. You're not getting your first choice. There are some exceptions to the seniority rule. If you're someone who can raise a lot of money for your party, or you're someone who's seen as a good, loyal soldier, you may end up chairing a particular committee. They'll reward you for your loyalty, for your ability to help the DNC or the RNC raise money. And if a new member of Congress does represent a district that is very competitive, for example, if a Democrat manages to win in a usually Republican district, they'll get a good committee to help their chances of re-election. So sometimes they make exceptions to the seniority rule and give them to people to help with re-election or because of their loyalty and fundraising abilities. Now, we used to see a lot more bipartisan cooperation on committees, expert testimony from both sides, more debate, more deliberation. We don't see that very much anymore. Usually, the party that controls the committee picks the experts that get to speak, limits the amount of time for deliberation or debate. And we saw this happen with the recent Supreme Court nomination concerns. Justice Barrett was essentially picked by the Republicans. There was almost no real debate about her background or expertise, and then the majority in the Senate rammed her through as the new Supreme Court justice. There was no real bipartisan support, no real bipartisan cooperation. Essentially, the Republicans said, we have the majority, too bad, we're just going to do what we want. Okay, so some of the other important structures, roles, bodies that do help out in Congress are, of course, the staffers. There's about 11,500 staffers employed by the various members of Congress. So they're in charge of helping to organize research, set and coordinate the schedules, and drafting legislation. So by and large, members of Congress do not call each other. Senator Warren isn't going to call Senator Duckworth directly. Someone from Senator Warren's staff will contact someone from Senator Duckworth's staff because the staff knows the schedule better. And they can work out a time for their two senators to meet. So usually, rather than going directly to the person, they reach out to their staff. Someone will call and say, hi, I'm calling from Elizabeth Warren's office. Does Tammy Duckworth have time on Thursday to meet with the senator? And then they'll work out a schedule. So staffers are critical to making sure that their members know when there's debate scheduled, putting together the legislation and helping them do research, making sure they're not double booked, interacting with the constituents. And sometimes during long breaks like the summer, they will hire college students to come work for them. So if you're interested in working for a member of Congress, you can contact your local Congress member and see if you could do an internship or something in their district. In addition to this staff, there's also staff agencies like the Congressional Research Service that will provide resources and expertise for and against legislation. Also an organization, the Government Accountability Office, gives Congress the ability to investigate financial and administrative affairs for a government agency. So if they want to know what's going on with the Department of Agriculture, they can talk to the Governmental Accountability Office. They can ask the Congressional Research Service, hey, we're looking at this new environmental regulation. Can you provide me with some information for and against it? So they have a lot of resources at their disposal that can help them figure out where they stand on an issue, help them draft legislation, and help them keep an eye on the executive branch. There's also caucuses made up of representatives and senators who may share an opinion, an interest, or social characteristic. They can promote legislation, encourage hearings, and ask agencies for favorable treatment for their groups. The Congressional Black Caucus is well known for its work on civil rights issues, social justice, and this does tend to cross party lines. We do tend to see Black Republicans and Democrats being involved in this caucus. Also, the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. So the women in Congress will come together and work on issues like unequal pay, contraception, and so on. So there's groups within Congress that will work together because they share some kind of goal or idea. Okay, any questions? Okay, so on Thursday, we'll talk about how legislation gets passed when they pass legislation. Special powers given only to the Senate, and hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion on pros and cons of term limits. To read the second half of Chapter 12 for Thursday, remember that your paper is due 2 weeks from today by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If you want me to look at a draft or you have questions, you can email me or you can call or text me. I think that's remember to vote next week if you haven't voted already. The election's in 1 week. If you have any questions between now and Thursday, you can email me or call or text me. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise, I will see you on